Chapter 9. Susie's Birth. "Give us this day," murmured Helena, "our daily bread." It was a prayer she prayed often these days. Although she was again receiving her regular government child support allowance, food was harder and harder to find. Even worse, Helena had been ailing for a while. She didn't have a lot of confidence in doctors, so she avoided them as long as possible. Finally, when she found it hard even to get on her feet, she went to see Dr. Reichels. After a careful examination, he said, "Frau Hasel, you are pregnant." Helena's mouth fell open. When she could collect her wits, she protested, "I am not pregnant." "You are pregnant," he insisted. "I will write you a verification that will qualify you for extra rations of bread, rice, milk, and butter." "Doctor, I know I am not pregnant. My husband is in Russia. He has not been on furlough in months." Dr. Reichels' voice was kindly. "Don't distress yourself, Frau Hasel. I see pregnant women all the time whose husbands are not at home. It's just human nature. People get lonely. In the meantime, here is the certificates that will get you extra ration cards. Come back in a month." Helena left his office shaking her head, but the extra food was a godsend for the children and supplemented their small garden plot. Before the war, she and Papa had leased this plot, and now she worked in it daily, using every inch of ground to grow vegetables, which helped them make it through the summer. What they couldn't eat, she canned for the winter, and in fall, they again went to collect the potatoes left in the fields by the farmers after the harvest. They also took the streetcar to its terminal stop and hiked into the woods where the ground was covered with beech nuts. They filled buckets and buckets with them, and back home, Helena crushed the tiny nuts and extracted a few cups of precious oil. "How's the baby doing?" Dr. Reichels would ask her, month after month. "I am not pregnant," she would insist. He would chuckle kindly and renew her extra rations. Finally, at 7 months, he admitted that he had made a misdiagnosis. This, of course, didn't do much for Helena's confidence in doctors. However, she recognized that God had used this man to provide for her family. Meanwhile, the bombing of Frankfurt continued. Night after night, Helena and the children were torn from sleep by the screaming air raid sirens. Night after night, they hurried through the fearful streets to the bunker. One night, the attack was especially terrible. "Gert, Lotte, Gert!" Helena screamed. "Get up, get up!" But she couldn't rouse the sleep-deprived children for several minutes, and by the time they reached the street, it was deserted. All around, they heard the thin whistle of falling bombs, and then the thunderous explosions. "We're not going to make it to our bunker," Helena thought to herself. In desperation, she huddled the children toward the basement shelter of a house on the way. Clawing at the door, she jerked it open. Hands reached out, pulled them in, and slammed the door. In the dim light of a kerosene lantern, Helena made out huddled shapes. She saw that the owners had obeyed the government regulations and equipped the shelter with gas masks, buckets of water, and blankets to put out flames. Lined up against another wall were buckets of sand. One of the Allies' dreaded weapons was the phosphorus bomb. When a drop of phosphorus hit your hand, it would burn a hole right through. Water wouldn't stop the burning. Only putting your hand in sand extinguished the phosphorus. As the hits got closer and closer, the basement floor heaved. As they had been drilled, the silent people in the shelter lay flat on their stomachs, put their fingers into their ears so their eardrums would not rupture from the concussion, and opened their mouths so their lungs would not burst from the air pressure. Finally, the bombing began to subside. The group in the shelter was running out of oxygen. Cautiously, someone opened the door a crack to reveal a wall of fire just outside. Everybody seemed too shell-shocked to do anything. In desperation, Helena took command. "We must get out," she said, "or we will suffocate." She grabbed the blankets, dipped them into the buckets of water, and handed one to each person. Tightly wrapped, the people dove through the flames. Kurt ran first, then Lotte and Gert, while she followed last. Gert, curious to see what was going on, peeked out of his blanket. A flame licked at his face, and by the time they arrived at the other side of the street, his eyebrows had been singed off. Trembling and bone-weary, they dragged themselves to their apartment. Miraculously, it was unharmed. The family had received no word from Franz in months. Was he still alive? Only occasionally would the news reveal where the pioneers were. On a map of Eastern Europe, Helena and the children plotted his course as best they could. One bleak evening at the end of January, there was a knock at the door. Gert ran to open it. "Guten Tag," he said politely to a tall, muddy stranger. Then his eyes widened. "Papa!" Sure enough, Franz was home. He'd been given 3 weeks furlough. Hitching rides on army trains and trucks, it had taken him one of those weeks to get home. But now he was here, and he was alive. The family spent many evenings recalling the dangers they had been through and recounting God's wonderful protection. In the daytime, Franz trekked across the city, seeking out coal merchants who could supplement the meager supply of fuel that Helena had left. She, in turn, used her carefully hoarded sugar rations in a cake made of oatmeal, cream of wheat, a little flour, and some baking powder. She had no eggs and no oil. Though the cake was heavy and coarse, the family feasted on the delicacy and enjoyed it more than the feather-like cream puffs they had liked before the war. With gleaming eyes, Gert inspected the medals Franz had brought back. He secretly took them to school one morning and showed them off to his friends. "My papa is a great soldier," he bragged. "He's helping Germany win the war." Proudly he strolled to the next group of children. Helena found the medals in Gert's pants pockets after he had changed into his play clothes. That evening, Franz gathered the family around him. He said, "I want you to imagine a country like no other on earth. The people are prosperous and live in nice houses. They have cars and wonderful food every day. The country has many laws. One of the laws proclaims that it is forbidden to worship God. Another law says that the government will kill children and grown-ups who are different. Only the people who are strong, healthy, and intelligent, and who follow all the laws of the government, will be allowed to live." The children had been following this fantastic scenario with wide-open eyes. Now Franz asked them, "How would you like to live in a country like that?" Their answers tumbled out. "It would be horrible. If they didn't like us, they might kill us." Gert summed it up the best. "I wouldn't be able to enjoy any of the wonderful things because I would be too afraid to leave the house. I couldn't even go to school in case the teachers thought I wasn't smart enough." Franz paused a long while. Finally he said, "Children, if Germany wins the war, it will become the country I have described." Much sobered, they knelt for prayer. "Dear Lord, please don't allow us to win the war. Let Germany lose soon so that the suffering will be over." All too soon it was time for goodbyes. This parting was even harder than the first had been because now they realized more than ever that they might not see each other again. After Franz left, Helena again felt ill and soon realized that this time she really was pregnant. With a heavy heart, she went back to Dr. Richels. How, with no end to the war in sight, would she be able to care for a fourth child? Dr. Richels confirmed the pregnancy and again issued extra rations. At least they would make it through another summer. As the war escalated, the Allies stepped up their bombings of Germany. Every night now the air raid warning sounded as squadrons of bombers droned overhead. Day after day, as Helena got the mail, she anxiously scanned the envelopes. She breathed a prayer of thanks each time there was not a black-rimmed one among them. She knew the dreaded news they contained. "We regret," they began and continued. "Your husband has died a hero's death for the fatherland." Thousands of German women were receiving such letters. Each edition of the newspaper, the Frankfurter Generalanzeiger, contained long black-bordered columns filled with the names of local soldiers killed in action. Now the fifth winter of the war was upon them, and a baby about to be born. For the other 3 births, Helena had been hospitalized, but this one was going to be different. Much of downtown Frankfurt lay in smoldering ruins. The hospitals that still functioned only accepted emergency cases. Aided only by a midwife, women had to give birth at home. On a freezing, drizzly night at the end of September, Helena rested on the couch in the tiny kitchen while Lotta and Gert washed the dishes and tidied up. It was chilly. The coal rations they had received for the winter were only enough to heat this one room, and the radiator was turned off unless absolutely necessary. Gert systematically went from window to window, making sure that the blackout curtains were tightly in place. He understood that even a chink of light might give away the location of the apartment buildings to low-flying enemy planes looking for targets. Carelessness could cause the death of many people. All afternoon, Helena had been in the early stages of labor. The children seemed to realize how helpless and despondent she was feeling. "Mutti," Lotta said comfortingly, "don't be afraid." "We are going to take care of you," said Gert. "We will help with the baby." Helena smiled through her pain. The contractions were now coming at regular intervals. "Lotta, Gert," her voice sounded weak, "it's time for you to go to bed." While the two children went obediently to their room, she turned her head to face Kurt. "Kurt, dress up well, put your scarf and mittens on, and go and get Frau Gabel, the midwife." Kurt stumbled out into the biting night. Blackout rules meant no streetlights, and not a glimmer of light shone from any of the dwellings. The only illumination was an orange glow in the sky from the fires that were consuming Frankfurt. As he hurried along, he heard the familiar drone of airplanes and the whistling bombs, and then the roar of explosions. The shock of the blast shook the houses and rattled the window panes, and cold air rushed by his ears and took his breath away. Finally, he reached the house of Frau Gabel, who grabbed her black bag and followed him into the night. Back at the apartment, she began issuing orders to him. "Get lots of water boiling," she said. "Then get some clean sheets and bring them to your mother's room. And it's too cold in here." "I turned the radiator on not too long ago." "Fine," she said. "Now you stay out here in the kitchen. I'll let you know if I need you." Hours later, Kurt heard a tiny wail. Like magic, Lotta and Gert appeared in their room doorway, their blankets wrapped around them. "We couldn't go to sleep," said Gert. "Is it born?" The three tiptoed to the bedroom. Lotta opened the door a crack, peeked in, and then opened the door wide. "Oh, Mutti," she exclaimed, "the baby is here. Did it hurt much? Is it a brother or a sister?" Helena smiled weakly and pointed to the cradle where the baby lay, already dressed and diapered. "You have a little sister. Her name is Susie." Delighted, they stood around the cradle and admired the cute little face and the tiny fingers that already had fingernails. They had a little sister. They knelt down by Helena's bed, and together they thanked God for the safe birth and a healthy baby. "I'm going home," Frau Gabel finally said. "You shouldn't need me anymore. Try and get some rest." The children crept back to their beds and fell asleep. But at 4 o'clock, air raid warnings ripped them from their slumber. Enemy airplanes were overhead again, and no one knew where they might drop their lethal loads of bombs. Kurt staggered blearily into Helena's room. "Mutti, what should we do?" "Get the children up," Helena said. "We need to get to the bomb shelter." "Can you make it? Or should I take Lotta and Gert while you stay here?" "No, we must stay together. We will all go. I will be all right." Quickly they dressed, wrapped the baby in blankets, and hurried out into the icy night. Dark figures streamed toward the bunkers half a mile away. Just as Helena stepped inside, the bombing started in the distance. Someone slammed and bolted the shelter's airtight doors. Almost immediately, the electricity went off, and the air circulation stopped. Silently and in total darkness, the people waited. There was standing room only. "Excuse me," whispered Helena, "but I just gave birth only 3 hours ago." "Here," someone said. "Move over here so you can lean against the wall. Make room for this woman, please." Not that it was strictly necessary to lean against anything. The bunker, built to hold 2,000 people, was often jammed with 6,000. Long ago, Gert had learned that all he had to do was pull up his feet and he was suspended between the packed bodies. Sometimes he even fell asleep in that upright position, legs dangling. More often, though, he had to fight for breath, and it was in that dark bunker that he developed the beginnings of a lifelong claustrophobia. The shelter began to rock from the pressure of explosions as the bombs dropped closer and closer. Helena felt ill as the air became hot and foul. "My baby, my Susie, she'll suffocate from the crush of bodies." Protectively, she held the tiny head against her chest. Lotta started crying. A priest murmured the Lord's Prayer. Women fainted, but there was no space to lay them down, and they remained upright by the press of the many other bodies. An eternity later, the all-clear siren sounded. Someone opened the heavy steel doors, and the cold, fresh air rushed in. Bathed in sweat from the oppressive heat, the people stepped out into the freezing night. When Helena and the children got back home, all were close to collapse. Helena looked at her exhausted, disheveled children and made a decision. "Never again will we seek shelter in the bunker," she declared. From now on, we will go to the basement." The apartment building's basement had been reinforced, and it was good for all but a direct bomb hit. "If God wants us to survive," she said to herself, "He can save us here as well as in the bunker." Several times each night air raid warnings sounded, and Helena had to drag the children out of bed and down the stairs. Yet even these trips downstairs became too wearying. Yearning for uninterrupted sleep, she finally set up their beds in the inhospitable basement, and the 5 of them slept down there. When Susie was just 3 weeks old, an order arrived that all women with children had to leave the city. Dismayed, Helena sought Sister Geiser's advice. "Who in the country will take a woman with 4 children?" she wailed. "Don't you worry," Sister Geiser comforted her. "I will go with you and make sure you get settled in." Gratefully, Helena embraced her friend. At 4 in the morning, they bundled the children up and headed for the small local station to catch a train to the main terminal in Frankfurt. When the train arrived, it was already packed. Sister Geiser and the 3 older children were able to squeeze into the first car, but Helena, with the baby buggy, desperately ran down the length of the train, finding no room. At the last minute, a soldier lifted the buggy into the car and hoisted Helena up after it. Pandemonium reigned at the main terminal. Hundreds of women with their children milled around while the League of Women officials tried to direct them to the right trains. Helena was sent to a train traveling to Eschenrode, a small village in the Vogelsberg Mountains. There, as well as elsewhere, each farmer had been ordered to house evacuees from the city. For 5 hours, the families waited at the train station. When they asked about the delay, harried conductors told them that no trains could run because the tracks were under heavy air attack. Helena felt faint and had to sit down on the baggage. The children, though ready to drop themselves, took turns pushing the buggy back and forth to rock the baby to sleep. Finally, the train arrived, and the barriers were opened. People stormed through them, each anxious to get a seat. Sister Geiser helped Helena to her feet, and slowly they followed behind the crowd. Peering into every car as they passed, they saw that the train was crammed. Finally, they reached the last car. "Will we be left behind?" Lotte asked. "There, this one," Helena said. "There's a whole empty bench inside. Quickly, quickly!" They loaded everyone on and gratefully sank onto the seats. The train pulled out of the station. The top of the cars had carefully been draped with Red Cross flags to signal enemy pilots that this train was protected by international agreement and should not be attacked. But this was war, and treaties were broken on both sides of the conflict. Low-flying airplanes swooped down. Some peppered the train with machine gun fire, while others threw hand grenades into the cars. Screaming women dragged their children under the wooden benches to protect them. People were wounded in every car except the last one. There, no bullet hit, no grenade exploded. Susie peacefully slept through the entire attack. "God saved us a seat in this car," Helena said quietly. Suddenly, the planes turned and disappeared. Uninjured passengers bandaged and comforted the bleeding women and children, while the train sat still for hours in the middle of nowhere. The journey began again at a snail's pace, and late at night the train rolled into the station closest to Eschenrode. It had taken all day to cover the 40-mile distance. A bus was waiting for them to take them to the last leg of the trip, and its engine roared to life as the families boarded. In Eschenrode it was bitterly cold, and 18 inches of snow covered the ground. The commander of the transport, a high-ranking League of Women officer, put the refugees in a schoolhouse several miles from the station, and from there assigned them to the different farmers. One of the women had 7 children. They were quickly divided up between several homes. "I do not wish to be separated from my children," Helena insisted. "If I am," she thought to herself, "they'll have to eat pork, and they won't be able to keep the Sabbath." She waited and waited in the schoolhouse, but no one was willing to take on a family of 5. Finally, all the placements had been made, and only Helena, Sister Geiser, and the children remained. In exasperation, the transport leader ordered the village innkeeper to provide a room for them overnight till she was able to make more permanent arrangements the following day. Disgusted with the inconvenience, the landlady assigned them to a small upstairs room. It was bitterly cold. The water in the hand basin was frozen, and ice flowers bloomed on the window panes. The bedding was clammy, and when Helena tried to build a fire with the wet wood, it smoked and hissed, but gave very little warmth. Susie, in her wet diapers, caught cold, and by morning she was running a high fever and had difficulty breathing. "Kurt," Helena said as she woke the weary boy the next morning, "they just told me that while the farmers are going to provide housing, we have to supply our own bedding and dishes. You'll have to go back to Frankfurt and get them." Kurt set out right away, walking miles through the snow to the station. There he boarded the train for Frankfurt. The train had no sooner pulled into the station when the air raid sirens went off and bombs hailed out of the sky. The terrified boy sought shelter in the cellar of an already bombed-out building. He huddled in a corner while the ground shook and fat rats scurried across the floor. When the attack stopped, he continued on the perilous journey to their home. At the same time, back in Eschenrod, Helena heard the ominous droning in the sky. She stepped outside to see squadrons of enemy bombers flying in formation toward Frankfurt to drop their loads there. "Lord," she prayed, interlinking her fingers and squeezing until her knuckles turned white. "Will there never be an end to this horror? You have brought us safely so far. Will I now lose my boy in the inferno in Frankfurt and my baby to pneumonia? I have no more strength. Help us all."